So good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's talk in the Park Street Corporation Speaker Series in Health, Humanities, and Ethics. So I'm Tamarra Hopkins. I'm a professor in the School of Social Work. I'm also the Associate Director of our Global Public Health and the Common Good program here at Boston College. So we're absolutely thrilled to have with us this evening Dr. Tamarra James-Todd from the Harvard T.H. School of Public Health. So on behalf of the Boston College community, welcome. The Park Street series was founded in 2017 with the help of a general bequest from the Quinn family. We owe a debt of gratitude to the Park Street Corporation for their generous gift, which aligns the late Father Quinn's interests in social justice and ethics with the mission of Boston College. My co-directors, Martin Summers, Amy Boyce, and I have been asked to bring to campus local, national, and international leaders to address timely issues in the intersecting fields of health, humanities, and ethics. And this is our last event for the semester. So I'm first going to introduce Dr. Najoke Thomas, who is an assistant professor in management and organization in the Carroll School of Management. So I met Dr. Thomas 2 years ago at a Park Street event just like this with our journalist, Linda Villarosa. So after we were chatting, I mentioned I'm a social epidemiologist. She said, I also have a master's in public health. So I thought, a professor of business with a training in public health, I have to get to know this person more, right? Only at BC would we have such wonderful interdisciplinary faculty. And so it's been wonderful to get to know her, and we've really seen our overlapping interests and our shared passion to address the needs and support women's health and well-being through systemic change. And so her research also overlaps so much with Dr. James-Todd. So first I'm going to have Dr. Thomas introduce her for this evening. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hopkins, for that wonderful introduction. That coincidental meeting that has been so generative. And I feel the same about this opportunity that I had to get to meet with Dr. Tamarra James-Todd. I'm going to share with you some of her amazing accomplishments and commitments to the community, but before I do that, I want to pause and just say that one of the things that I think is wonderful about Dr. James-Todd is her representing being a scholar and someone who cares very much about science. And to highlight the importance right now in the world of science as a beacon of knowledge and truth. So in this world of scientists, I really want us to thank her and welcome her for doing that. So let me share with you some of the many accomplishments Dr. Tamarra James-Todd has in her role as a scientist. She is a professor of Environmental Reproductive Health and Epidemiology in the Department of Environmental Health at the Harvard T.H. School of Public Health. She directs the Environmental Reproductive Justice ERGO Lab, which seeks to investigate the role of consumer product chemicals on reproductive and cardiometabolic health and health disparities. She takes a solution-oriented approach that includes running several randomized controlled clinical trials to improve environmental health literacy of consumer product chemicals as a strategy to reduce the risk of adverse health outcomes and health disparities. She's the PI of several NIH grants and trials, including the ERGO Study. She's also the Principal Investigator for the Community Engagement Core of the MEMCARE P42 Superfund Research Center, the Deputy Director of the Harvard NIEHS P30 Center, and co-founder of the Community Environmental Health Bootcamp. So as you can see, she's a very extraordinarily busy and productive scholar. Dr. James-Todd received her BS in molecular biology at Vanderbilt University, her MPH in international health from Boston University, and her PhD in epidemiology from Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tamarra James-Todd.
Thank you so much for the invitation to I'm really short. I'm really grateful to see you all here at 7 p.m. I was just saying to my very kind host. I'm like, I wouldn't be here as a student at 7 p.m. So I'm just, wow, this says a lot about Boston College. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey as I talk through this slide deck. And what I want to kind of just start off with is each one of us got up this morning and we used some products. It may have been brushing our teeth or washing our face. Maybe we took a shower. Maybe we have our own little regimen. And I just want you to think about what you did today. So did you know that the average woman uses 12 products each day? And that translates to about 160 different chemicals that you're exposed to each day. And the challenge is that not all of those chemicals are safe. And I'm showing you here just like a graph that I just kind of made up to reflect how many chemicals in personal care products do we regulate here in the US compared to in Canada and in the European Union. And it's worth noting that here in the US, we only regulate 12 because we really don't utilize a principle known as the precautionary principle. So we don't actually utilize the science that many scientists around the world have done to impact what we choose to regulate or not. We really rely on companies to make a good choice, and hopefully people don't get sick and sue. And that's really different than in Canada, where there's about 500 chemicals that are regulated, and in the European Union, where there's about 1,300 chemicals that are regulated. And just anecdotally, to give you a story about that, a few years back, I traveled to Sweden and I left behind one of my toiletry items and I needed to go to the store to purchase it. And I was able to go to the store and pick up the exact same product. But that exact same product was made differently by this company. It only contained 3 different ingredients. And I came home and I compared it to what I had at least a product that contained maybe 40, 50 different ingredients in it. So the same companies are making different products for the European market compared to our market. So what are some of the products that you all thought about when I paused there and said, what did you use today? And maybe some of you all use scented products, for example, lotions that may have had a little bit of fragrance. Maybe some people used hair products today. Others might have used some sort of cosmetics like lipstick, mascara, foundation. Some people may be wearing hair extensions or have a skincare regimen. Others may be using skin lighteners, and some may have their nails polished. And you may say, what does that really have anything to do with what you're talking about today? And more importantly, why do we do it? So what do we stand to gain from using those products? And a lot of people would say that the beauty industry, which is a $600 billion industry, is frivolous. The idea or concept of beauty is fleeting. Why do we care about that? Except what we do know from research that is ongoing is that there's economic power in really leaning into the usage of and appearance of the beauty standards and adhering to those. There's social mobility, there's social acceptance, and there's other forms of validation that we give as a society when we think of something or someone that's beautiful. But how can those ingredients in the beauty products and the products we use at large really impact our health? And while today I'm going to focus on beauty products, just as an example, I want you to also think about all those other consumer products that we use, okay? So again, I'm going to give this example, and this particular example comes from an aha moment that I had when I was a master's student right down the street at Boston University. And I became really interested in this story for a reason that I'll share in just a minute. But before that, I wanted to present a framework that I'm going to walk you through as I tell this story. So when we're thinking about what's in our consumer products, I want you to think about who's using what products, how is it being marketed to us, And how might we observe differences in the world around us that could really contribute to our being able to solve the problems that we see in the world around us? So we might observe differences in the products that we use and the chemicals that people are being exposed to that really impact the research questions that we might ask, like what are in the products in the first place? How do they impact our health? Are there specific windows of time, maybe childhood or older age, that we maybe need to be a little more cautious about? Where might we see this happening more? And who's at most risk? I also want you to think about the importance of critically asking the question of why. Why do people use what they use? So I gave you some examples in my previous slide, but the why matters because you're not going to get people to change their behavior if you don't understand why they're doing what they're doing. So someone might be using a hair product because their hair might be dry, for example, or somebody's using this particular skin routine because maybe their skin's oily. You want to understand why they're doing that so you can innovate and develop solutions that are safer, that work. So thinking about the solution-oriented components of our research, and then thinking about ways in which we can work together. Whether that, I really appreciated in the introduction that you have a public health researcher and a public health researcher, but you're practicing in two very different areas. And what might you be able to do when you think about working together, integrating that work into multi-level intervention-based work? Because the problems that we have are not siloed. They cross multiple different components of our lives so that we can get to the goal of all of us being able to achieve our best health. I also want you to think about this in the context of we don't just operate in our now. How we start using things in our everyday lives, what we do in our everyday lives really has a history behind it. I don't know about you, but if you think about even the toothpaste you use, I bet that might be something that you've been using for years. Maybe it's something that your parents were using too, and so there's a whole process behind that. Now I'm going to be talking about processes that extend much further beyond that, but we live at a time of not just discrete moments. And when we're talking about the things that we do, the products that we use, who we are and why we do what we do, there's a socio-historical process that's at play. That's really important to also understanding the complexities of why we do what we do as a part of who's involved in that decision making. And sometimes inequalities in those decision making. So you'll hear me talk a little bit about differences between men and women, and I'm talking about women's health tonight, and what happens when women may feel obligated to show up in spaces and in ways that maybe is not true for others. And then who has agency, who has the power to actually make change. And those components are really important to think about as we're kind of walking through. So going back to the example. So my aha moment came about in October of 2000. I just had started school down the street, doing a Master's of Public Health program. And I was in a class and I did not want to take. It was one of these introductory classes. It was Intro to Environmental Health. And I was thinking to myself, why am I here? I want to study HIV/AIDS. I want to do infectious disease epidemiology. And I'm sitting in the class and the teacher says, there's these chemicals that are in products that are being targeted to different communities of people. And so there are hair products that are being targeted to Black women and hair products that are being targeted to white women. And the hair products that were being targeted to the Black women, in writing, were saying hormonally active, hormonally rich. And that was worrisome. At the same time, this issue of Time magazine hit the shelves. And they were really curious, the writers here, about what they were seeing, observing in the world with respect to early puberty. And a lot of folks had kind of said, there's just differences. But they hadn't really thought about what was going on. And in this particular article, there was one sentence that said, maybe it's the hormones in the products that we use. And I said, that's interesting. And so I wanted to look at this a little bit more because I was working in a breast cancer research lab. And so for each year earlier a girl reaches menarche or starts her period, there's a 20% increased risk of breast cancer. And so in this study, which was a national study of pediatric networks, they found that Black girls were reaching menarche, or when they started their period, at a much earlier age. So about 60% had started their periods at age 12 compared to only about 35% of white girls. Now here's the thing. The authors here concluded that there might just simply be biological differences. There's something going on, and at the time, this preceded us in our awareness and our knowledge that race is a social construct. So they made this kind of general conclusion. They didn't really ask why, and they weren't particularly interested in solutions. They were simply documenting difference. And I thought to myself, I'm curious what else might be going on, particularly after digging into the historical research and seeing that the numbers were absolutely reverse. And so in the 1930s, you would see the complete opposite of this. And so I was really curious because simply genetics and biology doesn't change that fast. So as a doctoral student, I decided to found the Greater New York Hair Product Study. And the reason why was, in addition to that particular Time magazine article, I ran across a case series. So this is where a doctor notices something that's really curious or of interest. And in this case, this pediatric endocrinologist saw 4 young Black girls. They ranged in age from 4 months old to 4 years old. And they had all developed breast and pubic hair. I said 4 months old to 4 years old. So that is not normal, right? And so he wrote about this because he asked the parents, were you using medications at home, that could maybe have, resulted in this? What's going on at home? And the kind of story, when you listen to people's stories, the story that he learned about was that they were all using hair products on these young girls. And so he sent the hair products out for independent testing and found that they contained 3 different forms of estrogen. Hair products that were available on the shelf, not labeled as containing estrogen, were being used on young girls. They were being marketed to these families. And so I had that aha moment extended where I said, is it possible that why we saw that difference between Black and white girls and earlier age at menarche, is it possible that what's partly driving that, not in totality, but partly these differences in what's in these products, these consumer products? So in founding the study, I first had to learn how to ask a question. No one had really asked this question before. What types of products are people using? And so I was being trained as a quantitative researcher. I am an epidemiologist. And yet I had to really figure out how to collect people's stories or do qualitative research and understand the themes behind this. And so we conducted focus groups to learn, what did people use? What did they call them? We collected over 275 different types of hair products, different brands. We also learned that people did things in various ways with respect to how frequently they use the products, how long they use the products for. And importantly, we learned a host of things about things that we would not have otherwise known about. For example, people took birth control pills, chopped them up, put them in leave-in conditioner, heated that up, and placed it directly on the scalp. Now, not a whole lot of people told us they were doing this, but it was an important point to note that consumer products, just because a company produces a product in a certain way, doesn't mean that that's the way that people are using it. And so that was also really critically important as we were doing this type of research and figuring out ways that we could ask, how are you doing this? Now, what we learned was the majority of people were using these different categories of hair products. And then we were able to ask those questions about frequency and duration. We recruited over 350 individuals into this study. This was between 2004 and 2006. And we were doing this in New York, so we were able to do this in a really diverse setting. And we really wanted to get at the point of what were people's patterns of usage, because this could give us a sense of what people were being exposed to, and also testing the products themselves. So we found that in our study population, kind of the vast majority of Black individuals, and this is heterogeneous, so we could see both Caribbean individuals and those who were born in the US, had much higher levels of product usage for hair oils and kind of across the board compared to the non-Hispanic white population in this study population. We can also take a look at the labels. So, I titled this talk Behind the Label, and I'll note that the reason why I titled it this way is because the labels underrepresent what's actually in the products. So there's some key things that will almost always be labeled on a product. Things like fragrance, you'll usually see if a product contains fragrance, for example. But there are other things that you won't see. So, for example, fragrance contains hundreds of different chemicals. So you won't see those things. So what we know, though, is there's a variety of different substances. And when we look at this, there are some that are hormonally active that we could denote. So we're underrepresented here, okay? But among those that are typically listed, you see about 50% of African Americans are using products that contain these hormonally active ingredients compared to only about 8% of non-Hispanic white individuals. And I also know this is unbeknownst to people. They didn't know that they were using products that were hormonally active. And I think that has a real ethical issue at hand. So how does that connect to health? So we were interested, right? I wanted to understand whether or not there was an association with product use and agent menarche as a risk factor for breast cancer. And what we found was that people who used hair oils, we kind of consistently see that hair oils are the bad actor. They are highly fragranced, and we'll get into that in just a second. That those individuals had a twofold increased risk of starting their periods earlier, like less than 11 years of age. And so that, we've done this in multiple studies, and we continue to see this association. But what's in the products? So I told you, we could look at the label, and I'm just highlighting here. Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? I can talk loud. Sorry. So in red, I'm noting that there are different chemicals that you see, methylparaben and propylparaben. These are chemicals that are used in products for their antimicrobial properties. So think about many of the beauty products that we're using. We might be dipping our hands or we're using our hands. Our hands are very dirty. So this is a way that companies are able to address or deal with that. But I also will go back and say that in the European Union, they figured out how to address this issue and still make it safer. So just thinking about these things. So these were some of the things that I took a picture of one of my products way back when. You also see fragrance circled here with hundreds of different chemicals making up that fragrance. Fragrance would otherwise evaporate in a product if it wasn't for a chemical group that holds it in the product known as phthalates. So phthalates are a class of endocrine disrupting chemicals, and they are found not only in personal care products, but they are found in diet and food packaging, as well as medical tubing and medications. And I'm showing you here data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, a representative survey of the US population, US civilian population. And I'm showing you data on the concentrations of these chemicals just within us. I stratified this by men versus women on your left, and the women are in red, men are in blue. And I've also stratified this by race and ethnicity. And I often ask people, what do you notice? What do you see? And I think hopefully your attention's drawn to women are exposed to more of these chemicals. Is that a shock or surprise to anybody in the room based on what we're talking about? No. And then people of color have higher concentrations of these. And I also just note that the fragrance-associated phthalate, in this case we look at the metabolite, the thing that our body breaks this down pretty quickly. I can only show you 1/10 of that metabolite. We think that's the active ingredient. I can only show you 1/10 because we use a lot of this in the United States. And so there's much higher concentrations. It just would be off this graph if I were to show you that. I also want to bring your attention to those phenols or the parabens, those antimicrobials. And you also see similar differences by age and by race and ethnicity. The group that has that very tall dark gray bar are Black individuals, and you can see that Black girls have the highest concentrations of those. Kind of think back to that pediatric endocrinologist who was looking and studying what was going on in his patient population. In addition to personal care products, these are found in foods and diets, so you can think about consumer products like muffins and tortillas. Those are other sources of these chemicals. So circling back to other chemicals that are in hair products, it's not just those. Those are two classes that we study in my lab, but we shared the list of most commonly used hair products from that 350 individuals that participated in that Greater New York Hair Product Study. We shared that with Silent Spring Institute, which is literally right down the street here in Newton. And they had an independent lab testing all of these products and found that every single one of these products contained multiple forms of endocrine disrupting chemicals. So these are some of the classes and what are the health effects and which products those were found in. Again, I'm just talking about a particular example because I can't keep you here all night, but just to kind of highlight hair products as an example of a consumer product. I'll also just note that a recent consumer report came out back in February that caused a lot of controversy, particularly in the Black community. So a few years ago, I got a phone call from the author of this study, and she said, "Have you ever tested hair products?" Now, no, I'm an epidemiologist, I'm not a chemist. So I said, "No, I don't test any products." And she said, "Well, I really want to test the products because I think that there might be something in there." I said, "Well, maybe there's flame retardants or something, but I don't know of any study that has done that." I'm really glad that she did. She found lead levels. So lead, everybody knows lead's not good, right? Lead levels that were like about 600% higher than the maximum allowed daily level in some of these hair extensions that are used for braiding hair. They also found volatile organic compounds. So again, if you think about how people use products, these products are on people's hair. It's touching their scalp, very porous. It's near their nose, inhalation. So volatile organic compounds and lead in products that are not only used by adults, but are also used by children. And when we think about lead and the impact on neurodevelopment, what does that mean? What impact and implication might that have? But people use all sorts of products, and that's why I started off with asking you, what do you use? And so one of the things that we did was in a pregnancy cohort that's based here in the Boston area, we found that product usage varied by race and ethnicity. And I'm just highlighting here some of the personal care products that I'll be kind of talking about a little bit more. Hair gel, perfume, and nail polish were some of the kind of strongest as far as like differences seen with non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic populations using much more of these products. It's worth noting that not only are those the phenols, those antimicrobial chemicals, but also the fragrance, although it's perfume, that it's more commonly in these products. But how does it get under our skin and what impact might it have on our health? So you might say, well, the people who use these products, do they actually have higher levels of these chemicals in their bodies? And they do. So what I'm showing you here is what's called a heat map in epidemiology. And in this heat map, I'm highlighting, looking at the chemicals on the y-axis and then the products on the x-axis. And so for hair oils, remember I told you those were the bad actors. We see that fragrance-associated chemical, that phthalate, is 125% higher for people who used that product within the last 24 to 48 hours compared to people who did not use the product. So they have significantly higher levels in their bodies of this chemical. It's not just that the chemical, I've talked a lot about the chemicals, but what are they doing? So it turns out that when you look at this in totality, again, everything that we use as far as consumer products is often a mixture of things. And so together, they can work to have impact on our health. So here we did, in collaboration with Lisa Connolly at the University of Belfast, what's called a hormone receptor assay. So we wanted to see what happens if you plate these products on cells. Does it activate hormone receptors? They're called endocrine disruptors after all. Or does it deactivate them? So do they act as agonists or do they act as antagonists? And what we found was every single one of the products that we tested, again, we went back to, these are very expensive assays, but the most common group that we could test, the top 6, had hormonal activity. In other words, what that means is consumer products that are on the shelf, just because they, at least I thought initially when I was doing this, that it's on the shelf, it must be vetted, it must be safe. Somebody already did that, right? No, that's not the way we work here in the US. So these products are on the shelf, there's no packaging or labeling that says they're hormonally active, and yet every single one of them either operated as an agonist or an antagonist, or had partial activity either way for the estrogen receptor, androgen receptor, progesterone receptor, and glucocorticoid receptor. These receptors are involved in all sorts of processes in our bodies, and what this means is that these products have the ability to disrupt the way in which our body is operating. But we asked another question. We said, okay, these chemicals, they're much higher in certain, in people who are using these products, the chemicals in combination seem to have some sort of hormonal effect, but does that kind of translate to any real health impact? And so we did a study, this is the ERGO Study, again, a pregnancy birth cohort here in the Boston area. And I'll note that Black women have a 50% increased risk of preterm birth. What we did was we asked about product use across pregnancy, and we didn't just stop there. We said, we want to know how frequently people are using products. In other words, if somebody is using products daily, they should have higher concentrations of these chemicals and potentially a greater risk. And also, there may be a timing difference. So maybe if you're using them early pregnancy, it has little impact on preterm birth. But late pregnancy, it might have more of an impact, and that's what we saw. We saw that daily use of hair oils was associated with an 8-day earlier delivery. And there's very few things as far as traditional risk factors of preterm birth that are linked with that level of a difference, more than a week difference in delivery. Note that the less than daily did not have the same impact. So that also might signal, again, thinking about solutions, maybe it's not telling people stop using something, but maybe telling people to reduce it a little bit, particularly in later pregnancy. Also looking at that same cohort, we wanted to understand infant birth weight. It's kind of small for gestational age, and here we're kind of standardizing this, and we're also accounting for the fact that infant sex matters with respect to birth weight. What I'll draw your attention to and to kind of walk you through this graph, birth weight has a distribution. So most people are born at a certain, around a certain weight, and then you have people that are born at more of the extremes. So I'm showing you a distribution here. And I'm showing you 3 different distributions. One for people who did not use hair oils, so that's in blue, okay? One for people who used hair oils but less than daily, and that's in the red dashed line. And then I'm showing you the distribution for sex-specific birth weight for gestational age Z-score for the group that used daily. I think you'll note that we're shifting towards lower birth weight when we're looking at the group that's daily users, and the tails get bigger. So what's happening here is that there's more low birth weight infants among the people who are daily users in general. Now that has a host of effects, including infant mortality. So thinking about daily use of hair oils, what might you want to consider with respect to that? On average, though, hair oil use daily was associated with 300-gram lower birth weight in those infants compared to who were born to mothers who were using those products daily compared to those who were not. It's not just that these products can disrupt the endocrine system, but there's a whole concept that these products actually cause you to gain weight, and they actually disrupt your body's metabolism. They're also known as obesogens. So they can bind to our body's receptors that kind of increase fat cell development, and they can also shift how our bodies are kind of storing energy and make us feel like we're not full, like we're still hungry. They kind of disrupt our ability to for society. So they disrupt a number of systems and processes that have impact on risk of diabetes and liver disease. And so what does that mean? So I started with, children, even as young as 4 months old and 4 years old, being exposed potentially to higher levels of these chemicals in consumer products that parents thought were safe for them because of the way that we regulate products in this country. And so what that might mean is across the course of your life, you may enter into a time period where there's groups of people that have been long exposed to higher levels of these chemicals, and folks who maybe have lower levels of exposure. And that may have real impact on what happens during the pregnancy with respect to pregnancy complications. And that may also impact later life risk. So for the pregnant mother, what that may mean is in the postpartum period, there's more weight retention or weight gain, insulin resistance, and higher blood pressure for those who have these higher exposures. And that in midlife or later life, there's a higher risk of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes risk for those that are more highly exposed. And this whole concept of cardiovascular disease, diabetes begetting diabetes, leads to a potential cycle that we may want to consider how we might disrupt. Just to give you a few other epidemiologic study findings, we found that in a study by Lauren Wise, who's right here at Boston University down the road, that having used hair relaxers, particularly more frequently and for longer periods of time, increases the risk of having difficulty becoming pregnant. We also found that things like hair gel use increase the risk of insulin resistance and having higher glucose levels. Hair relaxer and hair dye use is associated with a 50% to 2-fold increased risk of breast cancers. And hair relaxer use in particular is associated with a 2-fold increased risk of ovarian, uterine, thyroid, and pancreatic cancer. So I talked about hair oils, but it's worth noting that hair relaxers was one of the things that was more extensively studied, albeit they are not used on people daily. People may go in intermittently, but they contain these chemicals that are formaldehyde-releasing agents. And I hope formaldehyde, that sounds very strange to you, like they put formaldehyde in the product. So they're not putting formaldehyde directly in the product, but it's being mixed together and it's releasing formaldehyde, which is a carcinogen. And so, this is another example of additional products that we made. If you think about it, the average person uses 12 products a day. What happens in the context of the things that you mix together inadvertently? How might that impact your health? Okay, so I could just stop here, and sometimes once upon a time I would stop there, and people would leave the room feeling very depressed and like, I'm gonna go home and throw out everything. And I said, no, I'm gonna stop ending my talks that way. What can we actually do about that? Again, I know that I spend a lot of time talking about products that seem to, target specific groups, but you can think about the products you use every day. And even when it says natural on it, we actually don't have anything in this country that regulates what is allowed or what's not allowed to say natural on it. So it likely doesn't mean a whole lot of anything, to be honest. So in thinking about what we can do about it, one of the studies that was done, Barrett Welch, who is now at the University of Nevada, we collaborated and did this work where we were interested in doing a hypothetical intervention. What would happen if we reduced the chemical concentrations? How much would help be improved? How many, for example, in this case, preterm births might we not have if we did that? And so what Barrett did was he used this really sophisticated statistical analytic tool and looked at and found that, for example, a 90% reduction in concentrations of those like fragrance-associated chemicals or those phthalates would actually contribute to about 31 fewer preterm births per 1,000 live births. So that's not, that's great, but it doesn't really tell us how to do that. So we wanted to better understand how might we get there. So I don't know why this didn't do this, but I'll walk you through what it did say. So we could say that everything is at the individual level. We need to change individual level behavior. And sure, that's a part of it. We do need to educate people. But what about who do we typically go to for health information? I mean, we may go to a family member, may go to the internet, but we often go to our doctors. We get annual physicals, and did you know that in medical school they don't typically teach environmental health? So if you go to your doctor and you say, hey, I learned all this stuff about consumer products, what should I stop using? The average doctor, unless interested in this topic, will not be able to tell you what to do. That is not something that they, have been trained in doing. So that interpersonal level of like, who are the trusted health educators? The neighborhood level. If I go into my local Walgreens, it may look different than someone else's local Walgreens. I mean, you can think about, down the road here in Mission Hill, when I go to the CVS or Walgreens, what's sold in those stores differs than if I'm here in Chestnut Hill. And so what impact might that have? Are there safer products in certain locations and less safe products in other locations? And then what are the systems at play? I mentioned a lot here, the regulations that we use. And regulations in this country differ with respect to what we're allowed to put into products, and might that have impact downstream on all of these things. So if we think about the individual level, there's things like this that we can download Silent Spring Detox Me app, or we could use the Environmental Working Group's Skin Deep app. We can also use the Breast Cancer Prevention Partners has this Non-Toxic Black Beauty Project app, and they kind of have a list. This is for anybody, honestly. It's a red list. Here are all the different chemicals that are typically found in personal care products. Maybe try to avoid this. Could you imagine though, walking through stores and, okay, I need to check the list, and that's an incredible amount of time, right? So maybe, some of this is helpful. I often encourage people, do use some of these apps because you can actually scan the products right away, and it'll give you a score. So the Environmental Working Group gives you a score. It says, it's green, yellow, red, and with Detox Me, actually gives you a recommendation. Maybe not this one, but try this one. And they even denote which store you're in, where you are, so they can offer you something that's sold at that store. Some of the individual level things that we do that really increase people's awareness of these chemicals is going out to the community. We do a lot of work with our community partners here in the Boston area. We host do-it-yourself product making. We do, like I said, I spent a lot of time today talking about beauty products, but cleaning products, for example. And thinking about all sorts of other ways that we can make sure that we give recipe books to people to how to make things. And so that's always great to go out to the community. We work with middle schoolers and do a lot of educational training in environmental health with middle school students during the summer. A lot of our students are teaching in those programs. And then we do community events around a variety of other concerns. I didn't talk to you about some of the other consumer product chemicals like forever chemicals like PFAS and so on, but we do a lot of that work. We're at Nantucket, which has a really high PFAS concentrations and levels there, due probably likely to biosolids and other consumer products. We have a social media presence. We have a podcast that we use to educate people. It's called Beauty Plus Justice. And we have a story map that walks people through kind of the history and then the present day experiences of exposures to these products. But that interpersonal piece, thinking about health educators, who do we go to get educated about our own health? And oftentimes it is our doctors. And so we wanted to improve doctors' knowledge and awareness around environmental chemicals. So for this, we developed and designed an educational module, and we tested it through a clinical trial, looking at whether or not we can improve the environmental health literacy around consumer product chemicals for obstetricians in this case. And we partnered with the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialties Units here in the Boston area. This is Dr. Blaine O'Reilly, who's the Director of Obstetrics, and Dr. Bayima Joseph. And it's narrative-based, so we wanted to tell the stories of people, because stories have real impact on people's lives and health. And so we did really incredible partnerships with folks out in the community. I'm just showing you data, descriptive data. Did we improve their environmental literacy? In blue pretest, we evaluated what did they know about these products and the chemicals in the products and the pregnancy health outcomes. And then in orange, we said, we tested them about 2 weeks afterwards. And you can see that the orange bars exceed the blue bars. That means that we did improve clinicians' environmental health literacy. What was also really important is, did they integrate it into their practice? Did they, months later, actually keep talking to their patients about this, and did they feel confident about it? So we went from 2% of doctors talking about this, and by the way, I should also say, we intended to enroll 100 people. This was a pilot study. It snowballed. People loved this so much that we enrolled 200 people. We had to cut it off. I had to pull in extra dollars to try to get people paid to do this, but it was really phenomenal. People loved this so much, and we went from 2% of people talking with their patients about these chemicals and products to over 95% of them continuing to do this 2 months later, okay? So that was really a great experience. It's also worth noting that when you improve people's environmental health literacy, you actually reduce their exposure to these chemicals. So going back to that ferret slide that I showed you, where the reduction has impact on, reducing adverse health outcomes, here I'm showing you that in particular, we saw significant decreases in these chemicals with increased protective behavior risk control, so knowing what you should do, basically, and also having interest in getting these regulations changed. The neighborhood level. So it does turn out that place matters. And I had a really phenomenal doctoral student, Marissa Chan, who's now a postdoc down at Columbia, who really wanted to answer this question. So she decided, and with our team, went to Boston's 24 neighborhoods, went to every store that sold hair products or a subset of the stores like the CVS's where there's multiple. And she created a database of over 39,000 different products, okay? We have the price information, the ingredients information, and importantly, I showed you that risk score that Environmental Working Group has. She scored each one using that risk score. There's a lot of missingness in communities. For example, Chinatown had the highest amount of missingness. Okay, so that says a lot. There's communities that, even with these tools, do not have access to data, okay? But what Marissa found, importantly too, was that the higher the risk score, the worse the products are, the more harmful ingredients there are in those products. And so Mission Hill, compared to downtown Beacon Hill, had over 2 times higher harmful products in their stores than these other communities. Importantly, it wasn't, I go back to how do people use products, there were more products that were leave-on products. So not only did they have more harmful products, more harmful ingredients, the products that were in those stores were things that were marketed to be left on your hair or scalp, okay? So oftentimes we think we're scientists, or doctors, or whatever. Here we have a lot of position and power, and that we're going to solve this problem. But we're often not a part of the communities that are being impacted. And so Marissa took this a step further. She said, I want to understand how communities see this. How do they see the things that are challenging to solving the problem, and how do they think about solutioning? And so she did what's called photo voice. And I don't know how many people are familiar with photo voice as a tool, but this gave the community members a voice through photography. They were asked to document the things that helped them to find safer products and the things that made it challenging for them to find safer products. And then we hosted 2 community art shows, and I'm showing you here one of the, I think this was the first art show. They spoke about their experiences doing this, and at the end of the art show, they were asked to fill in how this process, this experience was. We had about 100 people kind of turn out for the first art show. It was a phenomenal experience. I'm just showing you a picture, an image from one of these. Each participant took a photo and wrote a caption. And I'll note that this is from a local beauty supply store in Roslindale right here. And if anybody's ever walked into a beauty supply store, imagine like a Sally's or whatever, that's like the size of a super Walmart with just all sorts of products in it. It's overwhelming, and that's what this person called this. And it's worth noting that she wasn't just talking about how it made her feel, but she's also talking about the cost to her time in trying to figure out what's safe. She's not a chemist, she's an educated person. What happens to people who don't have that same level of educational attainment? But the average person is not a chemist and not going to spend this time looking at each individual product. And so what impact might that have on what choices people can make, thinking about agency again. It was also worth noting and thinking about those other two pieces that I asked you to think about at the beginning with respect to who's involved and what are the potential inequalities there. That the community asked that they wanted to be involved. They wanted to take lead along with having paraprofessionals and researchers and clinicians. What was interesting was that they did not trust big business to do this, and yet big business is who's actually looking into and adding these chemicals into products. It's also about accountability, so thinking about systems, and how can we change the systems at play. There's laws and policies that have been passed, like the Crown Act. There's a current lawsuit against companies that are making these hair straighteners and hair relaxers. And there's been a lot of focus, not just here in the US, but even internationally, around the cost of time to actually look and find safer products. So, I'll leave you with this. What's one step or action you can take with a product that you might have interest in? I asked a friend this, and she said, I'm gonna do something with my deodorant. And another friend said, I'm gonna do something with my toothpaste and my skincare products. But what can you do? One thing, not the overwhelming thing of going home and throwing it all out, but the thing that might even just be telling a friend. So I'd like to acknowledge and thank my team, and I can take any questions. Thank you.
So we'll do some Q&A now, so just raise your hand and I'll come to you and hand off the mic.
Hi, thank you so much. I found this lecture really informative. Towards the end there, you talked a lot about there being a big individual, community, and physician-based push towards more education around the chemicals in our consumer products. But to your knowledge, has there been any kind of push to actually make these products safer for people to use if they're unable to, access safer products or don't have the resources to, know which products are safer?
It's a great question. So one of the things that I didn't say at the beginning when I was talking about kind of the policy and regulations, before 2023, so December 20, recent history, the last time laws and regulations around what ingredients could go into cosmetic products was 1938. So you can imagine how many new chemicals have been introduced, how many new products have come to market. And so it's been really hard in the US to get policies to change. So recent history has been that the Modernization of Cosmetic Regulatory Act, or MEMCARE, was passed. And it did some things. For example, it did improve some regulatory processes to make sure that people have somewhere to report. Companies have to disclose some things. And while that's been great to at least see that occur, there's absolutely the need, particularly in the cosmetics and beauty industry, for additional regulation. And I think the challenge is that we don't necessarily, live in a society that, allows for things about for the greater good. We think about rugged individuals, and we like to, allow for people to make their own decision. I think the challenge is something that you brought up. How can you make an informed decision if you don't know?
I'm just wondering, is there any work around thinking about the impact on health for workers, or based on employment exposure? Based on employment, is there any work looking at health impacts for certain groups working in certain
So there's been a lot of and this connects back to the previous question as well. So salon workers, whether you're talking about hair salons, nail salons, folks in industries where they are, the exposure levels are much higher. It's day in, day out. A lot of those regulations are starting to change at the state level. And so, going back to, the state of California has been really leading the way to get additional regulations in place. The nail salon industry has been one of the primary industries that has been targeted, and much of that has been through coalition formation among the nail salon workers, which has been great to see. So again, go back to the importance of advocacy and how do you get, the consumer to also kind of push back. But it's been great to see at the state level changes are happening. I will also just put a plug in that I just only recently learned from Professor Wendy Green, who's down at Drexel, that there are also policies to reverse that for workers that have real implications. For example, states license cosmetologists. And so there's policies that are being, considered that would deregulate that. And what are the implications of that, both for the workers' health as well as consumer health?
Can you say something? Thank you very much for your excellent lecture. Can you tell us something about why do we need to have hormones in these products? What is the chemical reason? And second, can you say something more about the natural products, the organic? Because from what you said, there's no regulation, so I can say that I have an organic product that is not really organic, according to what will be the standards that will be disparities. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I'll note that remember the example I gave with the pediatric endocrinologist who tested the products that his families were using. We went back and tested those same products, and we did not find those 3 different forms of estrogen in those products. But where I got hung up was the product label. So while companies aren't directly, to our knowledge, because those companies didn't say they were putting estrogen in a product, they're not to our knowledge putting estrogen directly in. What they're doing is they're putting these synthetic chemicals in that have a property, they're holding fragrance in, they're serving as antimicrobials. So they're functionally doing something, that's why they're putting them in. But they also know that these particular ingredients, which they could use safer ones, are hormonally active. So they're functional, but they have health effects is the problem. And I think in thinking about, they regulate 12, maybe 13 chemicals, 1,300 in the European Union, we have a model for how we might do this in a better way. We just haven't adopted it yet.
I have a question. It's about this situation with to make more accessible the information for the high-risk group, but also this group have a lack of options. So it's so what do you think about that? So how we can make an advance in reducing the exposure? Because sometimes it's more cultural for Black women or for Latin women also. So what do you think about that?
I really appreciated the push that the student gave me on thinking about how we could do, so I do community engaged research, but I'm really doing it in a way that was kind of more, individual focused. Let's go and educate people. And I think that it's a both and, we educating people. But she really asked the question, what do the people want? And what we learned is the best answers don't come from us as scientists. The best answers, the best solutions come from people, the community members. And they really highlighted, people are not going to use things that don't work. The reason why, and that's why I said to ask the why. Why are you using the product in the first place? So if you tell people, well, that's silly, stop using that. Again, going back to the culture of it, it's culture, but it's also functionality. My hair is curly. I need to put oil in my hair, otherwise it will be dry. So how do you make sure that whatever oil you're creating, and this goes back to your question, I'm sorry I didn't answer the second part of your question, doesn't just slap natural on it. Add some sort of essential oil, which by the way, lavender, which is a very common essential oil that people use, has endocrine disrupting properties. It is estrogenic. And so how do you make sure that people aren't, creating things, that they're knowledgeable even within these communities? We want people within the communities to create things, but we don't want them to create harmful things. So how do we educate, as people are innovating in those spaces where they are a part of the lived experience?
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I was wondering from more of a public health perspective, do you think that these toxic ingredients would have gone so unregulated for decades if they were being put in products that weren't predominantly being used by Black women? And do you think that, what do you think this reveals about the racial disparities in the public health system in the United States and the lack of oversight that we have there? Because ironically, these are also all products that are promoting Eurocentric beauty standards anyways. So just kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I definitely, and I go back to that framework that I showed you at the beginning, the kind of socio-historical process. So we have a history, if anybody's interested, there's a book called The Hair Story. It's written by Lori Tharps, really interesting book, but it walks you through the history of hair in this country and beauty standards. And so once you kind of understand, this is the history from which we're kind of coming from. What people are doing, I think, as far as product usage and people not understanding. So if you look at who's manufacturing the products that are kind of widely used, those individuals don't look like and don't have the same lived experience as the people that are using the products. And as much as, maybe some people think there's malintent, others might just think there's a mismatch. That when I started doing this research years ago, and I said to my advisor, I really want to study this, she said to me, why would you want to study anything that's about shampoo and conditioner? It gets rinsed out immediately. And I was like, I wasn't talking about shampoo and conditioner. Again, going back to the how people use products. I'm talking about things that people use every day for maintenance. What impact might that have? And it took a while for people to understand. There was actually not much of an area or field of study looking at consumer products as it related to the chemical exposures. People just looked at the chemical exposures and how. And from my perspective, it's really important to understand how are you going to make solutions if you don't understand what's modifiable. I can't change somebody's race. I can't change their sex, because I also think there's something to be said that more women are exposed. What does it mean that more women are exposed? And what do we need to do as women to do something about this too? So that's something else to consider as we think about the different players, who's playing the complex relationships, what the inequality pieces are, and how we can use our agency to make change.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm just wondering, you as a researcher and gathering all this data and playing a part in finding out this information and then sharing it with us, what have you found yourself doing on a personal level for yourself? Have you been tossing out products that you're using? Are you switching them? The story that you shared where you said that you were in another country, I think, and you found the same product but with less ingredients. What are you doing, I guess, on a personal level to make these changes or switch things around?
Yeah, that question has layers. So there's the part of it where I remember being a kid loving to, whenever I get the chance to go to my grandmother's house, I would love to go and open up her perfume drawer. And I just loved perfume so much, still do, but I do not use perfume anymore, for example. And that was kind of a gradual process for me. I mean, honestly, I still, if you think about it, it's not even just, again, we talked a lot about beauty products, but thinking about cleaning products, and what does clean smell like to you, right? Thinking about I like a certain scent, but I kind of don't use that anymore. So we changed out our soap that we use, all of those things. I think one of the biggest things though was when I had children. And so, being a bit more cognizant that I don't want to harm them in any way. And so considering what I would use or what I would not use. And then I'm in a stage right now where I have a 12-year-old and she's really into all sorts of like, you know, fragrance and other things. And I'm like, no. And she turned to me and she said, and this is like the gift word, like, you have to let me learn. I have to learn this. And I was like, that's true. So it kind of circles back to the community. Like, you can't just tell people to stop doing things. You have to educate people and give people the agency to make the choices, that things that they want to use or change and do. But I have changed some things, and I apparently don't have very much influence on my children. Okay. One more. Oh, there's
do you think that the increase of usage of social media and our sort of beauty standards being subjected onto younger kids, do you think this sort of problem is going to worsen over time?
So I brought up the 12-year-old because I remember somebody coming to me. This is one of our recent master's student, and she and my 12-year-old now are befriending each other because they told me about this coin phrase of the Sephora kids, and I was like, what in the world is a Sephora kid? I don't know what that is. And then I started learning all about that, and I do think the challenge that we now have is how do, like, anyone can get on social media and, you know, show you a new makeup style, show you a new this, that, the other, and profess that it's safe and natural when it, like, they haven't necessarily gotten an education around this part. And so how do you address that? One of the things that I'll say is Silent Spring Institute is doing a study, I think actually just came out within the last month, working with influencers. So educating influencers around, you know, these environmental chemical exposures, and then seeing what impact it has for them to, you know, put that information out there and see, you know, for the followers, if there's, you know, improvement in being able to identify safer products. So, great question. I do think that that is what we'll need to definitely take into consideration moving forward.
So wonderful talk, and I wanted to bring us full circle because one of the things that I have really been impressed about you, and you did share your persistence with questions that other people may not have thought was interesting or worthwhile. And so I'm curious if you could share maybe a preview of some of the questions you have going forward.
Yeah, our lab is really interested in understanding environmental health literacy a bit more, and we're doing. While we've done studies now looking specifically at does this impact, you know, clinicians, does this impact, you know, or is associated with exposure levels, what we haven't done is to see what impact might it have on these kind of educational interventions on health. So we're digging more deeply into that, and then I really appreciate your question because that's another avenue. Becoming aware of the fact that, I don't know, how many of you all kind of, when you started like having your own like kind of skincare grooming process probably in your like teen years, and we've really understudied that age group as it relates to this. So that's another area, like thinking about, you know, how can we actually get on the ground at the time when people are actually developing their routines around, you know, grooming and so on that could maybe impact health in the long term. So. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Dr. James.